Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. It's a beautiful summer morning. It's actually one of those mornings where you're starting to feel just the first hint of fall in the air, which I'm going to be honest, I have mixed feelings about because I love summer. I'm not ready for it to end, but nonetheless, it does feel beautiful outside today. So while it's nice and early in the morning and not too sunny yet, I think that it is a good time to kind of do the part 2 to our garden tour from last week, I want to say. And we are going to talk about the garden on my deck, which is completely a container garden. So today's going to be a little bit of a shorter garden tour, just kind of a container garden tour. I'll show you what I have growing in pots on my deck. You'll find that while it is definitely possible to grow a bigger variety of plants than I have growing on my deck, up here you'll find that for the most part I have a lot of tomatoes and peppers and herbs, and there's a few other things sprinkled in as well. So as you can see, I brought a few of my favorite herbs up here to show you. So first of all, this is a spicy bush basil, and this is one of my favorite basils to grow, especially to grow in pots. It has a really great basil flavor. It grows in a container really well. As you can see, this plant is beautiful. And I've been finding actually the last 2 years that the basil that I grow in containers on my deck has been more successful than the basil that I've been growing in my in-ground garden. So while I do still grow some in my in-ground garden, I have been focusing more on growing basil on my deck. So up here, the next herb that I have is a creeping rosemary. Now, once we take a look at all the plants that I have on the deck, you'll see that I also have just a regular upright rosemary plant. I like to grow rosemary in pots because in my area, rosemary is not winter hardy. So that basically means once we get our killing frost for the year, which in my area usually happens sometime mid to late October. So once that happens, the rosemary, if I have rosemary outside, that will die. By growing it in pots, I'm able to contain it, and then I can bring it in my house in the winter and do my best to keep it alive over the winter. That way we have fresh rosemary all winter long. So that's why every year I grow at least one rosemary plant in a pot on my deck. And now over here I have another variety of basil. You can see this is a beautiful deep purple basil. This specific variety is called purple ball basil. Now you can see that it has these small little leaves. I really like just the contrast that a little bit of purple basil adds to my basil patch. It's just, I think it looks beautiful growing in a pot on my deck, and I think it makes cooking look beautiful too when you have a variety of colors and flavors mixed in. So now that we've gone through these little examples that I've brought up here for you, let's take a look at all the plants that I have growing on the deck. And I do just want to, as an aside, mention my chickens are extra talkative this morning, so you've probably already heard them kind of chatting in the background. As you can see, there they go again. So just pay them no mind, they're just greeting the morning. So I hope that you will enjoy hanging out with me and taking a look at all the plants I have growing on my deck. So as we go through all the plants that I have growing here, if you watched my previous container garden tour, which I want to say was about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, you'll notice that there's quite a bit of change. There's been quite a bit of growth, and there's also been some disease progression, as you can see in some of my tomatoes back there. So we'll go ahead and take a look at everything, both the good and the bad. And that way, I just kind of want to share with you as my garden grows and changes as the season goes on, which, you know, there is a lot of good going on, but, you know, there's some not as great stuff to see too. Okay, so let's take a look at this pepper plant first of all. This pepper plant, as you can see, is starting to get some fruit. I don't know how well you can really see it all in there, but it's got a few decent sized fruits and then a few smaller ones up here. This is a Corno de Toro pepper, so I'm really looking forward to harvesting that. Now this plant is my son's clementine plant. You'll see this is a much slower growing plant, so there probably isn't much change between this plant and the way it looked at our last garden tour, but I figured I would give you a look. Back here in this pot, I know it's kind of hard to distinguish plants from one another in this little jungle I have going on here, but back here in this pot, I've got a couple shishito pepper plants. You can see that we've got some that are pretty close to harvesting. So we have had a couple harvests of shishito peppers already this year, and they have been delicious. The majority of the peppers that we've harvested have been from those 2 plants in that pot there. We've gotten a couple from the plants out in the garden, but for the most part, if you watched my regular garden tour, I think I probably posted it a few days to a week ago. I mentioned in that garden tour that the peppers that I have growing on my deck are doing quite a bit better. They look quite a bit healthier, larger, they have more fruits than the peppers in the ground do. So these shishitos are one example. The peppers on the deck are producing quite a bit more than the peppers in the ground. So I'm going to see if the peppers in the ground end up catching up as the season goes on. I'm not really sure, but historically peppers do usually perform better for me in pots than in the ground. Now, this is lamb's quarters, which is technically a weed, although it's edible. It's delicious. It basically tastes like spinach. So sometimes I let a few of these grow just to kind of snack on, and they make great snacks for my daughter's rabbit too. Now, as you can see, I've got a beautiful sweet basil plant in here. I like to, when I grow these big pots of both peppers and tomatoes, I like to add some companion plants in there just to kind of make the best use of space, and I think that it makes for a healthier growing environment. So we've got a nice sweet basil plant there. So as we move on to these tomato plants, you can see I've got 3 tomato plants here, which are definitely showing some signs of disease. That's pretty normal for tomato plants in my area this time of year. It might be slightly more disease than we normally get at this point in the season. We've had a lot of rain this year. It's been pretty humid and pretty consistently rainy, which leads to conditions ideal for disease to develop. So unfortunately, that is the reality of it. I do have to do some pruning work, come out here and do some maintenance. That's not going to eradicate the disease, but it will hopefully slow down the spread of it. And my goal here is not to keep these tomato plants healthy forever. My goal is to be able to ripen and harvest all the tomatoes that are on the plants just to make sure that I am able to get a good harvest. So this first tomato plant here is a Berry's Crazy Cherry. We've been harvesting quite a few tomatoes from this. As you can see, it definitely has some more down here. This is actually from that same plant that's kind of sprawled over. See, I've got some nasturtiums. And down in here is the upright rosemary plant I mentioned before. So I've got the trailing one and this upright one. Down here I've got a mammoth basil. This is actually kind of a small basil plant. I started this a little later. I have a larger one that we'll get to in a few minutes, and I'll show you that. My next tomato here is a Matt's Wild Cherry. You can see this one yields an abundance of small red cherry tomatoes. So these tomatoes are really small, definitely smaller than a lot of cherry tomatoes, but they are really intensely flavored and really delicious, so I always grow this one. And then over here, you can see this tomato plant has some tomatoes that are blushing and will be ripe really soon. I am not 100% sure about this tomato plant. So I have that tomato plant labeled as a horizon tomato. I did grow the horizon tomato last year, and they were smaller red globes, kind of more like what you would find at the grocery store, if you get the little plastic package of Campari tomatoes. They were around that size, maybe slightly larger. But as you can see in that pot there, that is not what the tomatoes look like this year. So I'm wondering if I mixed up my labels. I'm not 100% sure, but either way, it does have some big, delicious looking tomatoes on it. So I will be excited to harvest those. I'm sure they'll be delicious, whatever kind they end up being. So here's a closer look at some of these tomatoes. You can see the Berry's Crazy Cherry here. But this is what is supposed to be a horizon tomato, but that does not look like that to me. It looks like a large heirloom slicer. Back here, there's a little bit of a jungle. You can see I've got some bush beans here. We have actually been harvesting these quite a bit. These are yellow beans. You can see a few of them in there. And they're kind of almost crowding out my peppers. But back here, I have a Sugar Rush peach pepper, and can see there's a couple peppers here. This one looks like it's actually starting to ripen. I do not know what I'm going to do with these peppers. I'm thinking they're probably going to be too spicy for me, but we're going to give them a try and see what happens with them. And there's a closer look at some of those yellow beans. Now this pepper plant has gotten really tall. As you can see, this one actually probably could use some support. This is another Corno de Toro, which is a red elongated pepper. It's supposed to be very sweet and makes a good substitute for bell peppers. So when I grow bell peppers, I find that I don't always have the highest yield and the best production. A lot of times the peppers tend to be a little smaller, and there tend to be not quite so many of them. So this year, while I am still growing some bell peppers, I'm experimenting with growing some other sweet pepper varieties that I can kind of use instead. And Corno de Toro is supposed to be an excellent variety to use as kind of a bell pepper substitute. So I have a few plants of the red Corno de Toro and a few plants of the yellow variety as well. I haven't harvested any peppers from them yet. They do both have some decent sized green peppers, which I could harvest if I wanted to use them green. But I usually prefer to let my bell peppers ripen to their final color, and so I'm going to do the same with the Corno de Toros. I'm really looking forward to trying those because I have heard great things about them. Now back here, as we return to the pepper jungle, I have a really large pot here, and in this pot I have 3 jalapeno plants. Now these are early jalapeno peppers. Let's see if we can get a better look and see some larger peppers. Down here you can see a few. When they start to get these streaks like this, that's usually a sign that they're done growing and ready to harvest. So I could go ahead and harvest these anytime I want to. We have been harvesting jalapeno peppers here and there as we need them. If we have a taco night, sometimes I'll harvest a pepper and we can chop that up and put it in our tacos as well. I haven't done a large harvest yet. I do usually end up pickling and canning a handful of jalapeno jars to kind of get us through the winter months. And sometimes I like to make cowboy candy as well. So I may end up doing that this year if we get a good enough jalapeno harvest. But as I said, so far this year we've only been harvesting a random pepper here and there as we need it. Now, I know when I'm growing this many plants in a small space, they do tend to really take over and become almost indistinguishable. But let's head over here. I did mention when we looked at that tiny mammoth basil plant that I had a larger one. And this is that plant. And this one looks beautiful and healthy and thriving. So I'm really happy with this. This one, again, has a delicious flavor. The larger leaves make it a little versatile for different uses, so I really do like that. You can see back here in the pot behind that basil, I've got some red swan bush beans. You can see there's this beautiful purpley pink color, and I really like them because they add really beautiful color and flavor to a bean harvest. Now, I really do enjoy those red swan bush beans. I enjoy growing them. I think they're beautiful. They're delicious. I have noticed with those beans, though, they do tend to get tough a little bit earlier than a lot of other bean varieties. So because of that, I just make a point to harvest them at a little bit smaller size, and that seems to work really well. So that's just something to be aware of if you're interested in growing that variety. Now, in this sprawling pot here, you can see I have a lot more lamb's quarters, which these don't really look very good, so I need to either give these to my daughter's rabbit or I need to pick those out. But in here I have 3 tomato plants, which you probably can't even see because they've sprawled out of the pots. So over here, all these stems here go to you can see it a little bit in there, sun gold tomato. And I've also got this currant tomato down here. You can see it has an abundance of these tiny, tiny red tomatoes. Now, I said with the Maxwell cherry that it had small red tomatoes. These are probably half the size or less even of those, but they have a great flavor and they're really delicious. You can see I like to have nasturtiums and plants like that kind of mixed in with my other plants. Up here I have another tomato. Again, you can see it has some pretty advanced disease progression on it. Despite that, though, there are a couple tomatoes in here that are starting to blush, and those should be ripe really soon. I'm really excited about those. So those tomatoes are a variety called Azoychka, which is, I think it's a Russian heirloom. I've never actually grown it before, but I have heard great things about it. And, well, you know, I had never actually heard about it until I got a seed packet of those in a grab bag that I ordered. But once I got the seeds, I looked it up, and then I heard a lot of great things about that variety. So I'm really excited to try it. That's kind of a golden orange tomato. And as you can see by those tomatoes there, the ones that are starting to ripen are turning sort of a yellowish color. So I'm really excited to try those, and hopefully that'll be a new favorite tomato for us. Now you can see some more basils through here. In this pot here, I have a mix of basil. I've got let me move these peppers out of the way. I've got one of those mammoth basils, I've got a spicy bush basil, and I've got a purple ball basil all growing together. And I'm hoping to be able to bring some of these potted basils into the house over the winter. Over here, I've got another pepper plant. This one is called the Lesia pepper, which, as you can see, got a tiny little fruit on there. This one's really just starting to fruit. This is supposed to be a delicious red pepper. So that pepper, I think, is probably fairly similar to a bell pepper. Could potentially be another bell pepper alternative that I'm growing. Really, I just saw the description of that pepper in the Baker Creek seed catalog, and it sounded delicious and amazing, so I had to try it. I have not harvested any yet, but it's supposed to be a really sweet pepper with really thick walls. It just sounds really delicious, so I'm hoping that we'll get to harvest some of those soon. I do actually have a couple of those pepper plants actually out in my garden as well. And while this plant looks better, this plant on the deck is larger and healthier, I do have some larger fruits on the plants out in the garden. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on those, and I think I'll probably get an earlier harvest from those, although I may get a larger harvest overall from this plant here. Now in front of the Lesia pepper, I have this bell pepper that's kind of sprawling. This is a King of the North bell pepper, and you can see it's got a respectable sized bell pepper on it, obviously not close to ready yet. This is a bell pepper that starts off green and ripens to red. You can see it's got a handful of peppers throughout. So you can harvest it as a green pepper if you want, or you can let it ripen to red. I really do prefer my peppers to be their ripe color. I find that they're a lot sweeter. They have a more rich and complex flavor. I really prefer them that way. But a lot of people also say that if you harvest some of your peppers green, some of your first peppers early on in the season, that's going to kind of stimulate the plant to produce more, and you'll end up with a larger harvest overall. So let me know if you have any experience with that. What do you like to do with your first bell peppers? Because I want to make sure that I get to eat the delicious peppers the way I want them, but I also want to make sure that I get the biggest harvest possible. Now in this pot here, you can see I have another large sweet basil right in the front. But in the back of this pot, I have 2 corbaci pepper plants. And through here, you can see there's a few peppers not ripe yet. I believe this is another one that you can harvest ripe or unripe, depending on the type of flavor you're going for. But you can see it almost looks like a cayenne pepper. A little bit hard to see down here, but there's another pepper down here. And over here is a third one. So I'm excited to try that pepper as well. Peppers are a lot more tolerant of crowding than a lot of other plants, which I think is probably why peppers have always done really well for me in pots. And when I have a large pot like that, a lot of times I'll put multiple pepper plants in the same pot. That's not something that you could necessarily pull off as easily with something like a tomato that really needs more space. But peppers, you know, there's a garden saying that says peppers like to hold hands. And the idea behind that is that you plant your pepper plants close enough together so that once they're mature, their leaves will be touching. And I'm not really sure exactly why that is beneficial for peppers, but a lot of people do that, and it has been my experience as well, that peppers really, as I said, they can handle crowding pretty well. So I do tend to space my pepper plants fairly closely. Now here we have yet another tomato plant. This one seems to be handling the disease a little better than some of the others, but it is definitely not immune. As you can see, it's got a fair amount of disease to it as well. Now, looking at the actual tomatoes here, this is a green tomato plant where the ripe tomatoes are actually green. As I can see, this one is a little bit of a brighter green than the other tomatoes. It doesn't feel soft yet, so I don't think that that's ripe. But I've never grown green tomatoes before, so I don't have any experience being able to identify the ripe fruits. If you do have experience with that, this one specifically is the evergreen variety, so especially if you have experience with this specific variety, I would love to hear how you like the flavor and how you tell when they're ripe. Now over here I have a few more jalapeno plants. I've got 3 pots, each with a jalapeno in them. This is a different variety. This is called the Craig's Grande jalapeno. It's supposed to be a little bit larger and spicier than the early jalapenos that I'm growing on the other side of the deck. I don't think I've actually harvested any of these jalapenos yet. But as you can see, we've got quite a few fruits forming in these plants, so we really can harvest these anytime we want to. And over here in this really large pot, I've got 3 more tomatoes. These are all cherry tomatoes. You can see here I've got a sun gold tomato, which is my favorite cherry tomato, by the way. Down here is an arm that's kind of sprawling off a Rosella tomato plant. You can see this is not ripe yet, but it's going to be a nice deep, rich, smoky purple color, which should be really delicious. Now over here, you can see the other side of those tomato plants that we were just talking about, and some more sun golds. When I grow tomatoes, cherry tomatoes anyway, in pots, I don't usually support them. I usually kind of let them sprawl wherever they want, which admittedly can lead to a little bit of a tangly mess. It's kind of part of the reason I've got that whole jungle look going on my deck here. But that's just the way that I prefer to grow them. And when they're in pots, I usually let them drape over the side. They just kind of intermingle with all the other plants, and it does make harvesting a little bit of a challenge sometimes. You kind of have to dig through all their foliage to find your tomatoes. But that's the way that I like to grow them. So here you can see I've got another really tall pepper plant. This is another Corno de Toro. This one, I believe, is a yellow variety. Yes. So this is a yellow Corno de Toro, which I don't see any fruit on it yet. It does have some flowers, so it should be fruiting fairly soon, but I'm really looking forward to trying that. And over here, I actually need to do some harvesting of this. This is a holy basil plant, which is also called Tulsi. This is a great adaptogen herb. Makes a really delicious tea, and it is just all around really great for you. And the last deck plant that we'll talk about today is this pepper, which you can see is large and thriving. This habanada pepper is supposed to be similar to a habanero, but without the heat. So the appearance is supposed to look like a habanero, and the flavor is supposed to be like a habanero, minus, of course, that spicy kick that habaneros really have. I've never actually tried this before. I did try growing these plants last year, but they were not really successful. We had a really challenging pepper year here in Connecticut last year, So I did not end up getting a ripe harvest from my habanada plant, but I think it's pretty safe to say that we will this year. So I have never grown these before, as I said. I've never tried these. So I'm really curious to hear how you use these. Do you just kind of use it for snacking or cooking, or what do you use habanadas for if you've ever grown them before? Because, I mean, it looks like, as you can see on the plants here, I'm not sure how well you can see, but it's loaded down with fruit, but it has dozens more flowers starting, so we should get a pretty significant yield from this plant. So as I said, I would love to hear how you use the habanada pepper. So thank you so much for joining me out on my deck this morning and taking a look at my container garden with me. I really do appreciate getting to share the progress of my garden as it grows with you. And I know my future self, when I'm sitting inside in the cold winter, will appreciate getting to watch this video and look back on how beautiful my summer garden was at the time. And I do really find it useful to go back and see the progress of my plants as they grow. You know, there's always a point in the season when you feel like, oh, my plants are never going to grow, my plants are never going to yield. And it's always encouraging to look back on your past gardens and to see that, no, they will grow, they will yield. The garden, while it can be a little bit of a challenge, tends to have more success than failure in my experience. So that's always definitely encouraging. So again, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you are encouraged to try growing some plants in pots. No matter how small of a space you have, you can always grow something, even if it's just a couple herbs inside on your windowsill. So I definitely encourage you to just give it a try. So I hope you're having a great day. I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.